Welcome back to the Gentleman's Gazette in our series What Men Really Wore. Today we look at the style from 1900 to 1910, which is sometimes also referred to as the 1900s or the Edwardian era, even though technically that started in 1901. You've probably heard of the phrase turn of the century style, but what does it really mean? And how is something men wore in 1901 different from what they wore in 1911 or 1921? Well, we'll discuss it in this video. The decade began during the tail end of the Victorian age, and with her death on January 22nd, 1901, the world truly changed into a different era. Technology was developed at a rapid pace, and people were hopeful that the future held something brighter than Victorian austerity. The modern world as we know it today, with weekends and leisure time, started back then. Laborers were offered longer breaks and allowed to enjoy themselves, even though that's not quite obvious from the photos of the era. No, just kidding. In fact, at the time, exposure times of cameras were so long that people simply couldn't stand like this for several minutes. So they just stood in a relaxed way, and therefore they usually looked pretty serious. Due to the many monochrome black and white images and photos from this era, it's easy to assume that it was rather dull and unexciting. However, the opposite was true. I know the simplicity style is perpetuated in period dramas, but people actually wore quite a bit of color. To keep the video manageable, we'll just look at the clothing in the US and Europe. Otherwise, it'll be almost as long as the decade itself. Unlike today, the most important thing in your head in 1901 was the hat. No, the most popular style was not a top hat, it was a one-piece flat cap. If you're not sure what that is, we did an entire guide on the flat cap in the video on our channel. Back then it was much smaller and shorter than, let's say, in the 1930s. Typically, those worn by working class men for work and during the day, but also by upper class men during sports or hunting pursuits. Bowler hats were also commonly worn even by upper middle class men and upper class men, despite their working class origins. At the beginning of the decade, the bowler hats had a very similar shape to the ones from the 1890s, tall crown and tight brim. However, by 1910, the crown had significantly reduced in height. Nevertheless, they maintained their tight dorsett or pencil curl at the edge of the brim. Of course, we also have a full video dedicated just to bowler hats. Another really popular hat of the era was the Homburg hat, who got its name from the German town of Bad Homburg. It was King Edward VII himself who liked to vacation in Bad Homburg and saw the hat there and brought it back and popularized it. In 2011, we visited the town of Bad Homburg and their local hat museum, and of course, they had lots of Homburg hats, among other ones. At this time, Homburg hats were softer than a bowler hat or a top hat, for example, and they had a different kind of brim curl, which is also known as the kettle curl. It's not quite like the one on a bowler hat, but it's distinctly different from a regular felt hat today. Sometimes the ground height was low and the curve was extreme on the Homburg hats. Homburgs could also be found in a variety of colors and finishes, sometimes with a brim ribbon that was a different color than the headband. So unlike today, where a Homburg is considered to be a very formal hat, in 1905 you could wear it in many different situations. During the warm months of the year, straw hats were something that pretty much every man wore. Specifically, the bowler was a staple in men's fashion. So what's a bowler hat, you might wonder? It is made from sennet, which is a plaited straw, and it is flat on top with a flat brim and a low crown height. Often you'll see them with some colorful headbands because they're fun. Because so many men wore them, some historians point to the bowler hat as a sign of equality, because no matter what class you belong to, you wore a bowler hat. Another popular summer hat of the Edwardian era was the Panama hat. President Roosevelt wore one of those straw hats at the Panama Canal in 1906, and therefore it became the Panama hat. Of course, much to the disappointment to the Ecuadorians, where traditionally the Panama hat has always been woven. Yes, you got that right. There was no Panama hat ever woven in Panama. Now, if you want to learn more about the famous Panama hat, we have a full-fledged video guide. Of course, men also wore a top hat. Now, that was a mark of distinction from the middle class and the working class men. These hats were typically custom-made, expensive, and luxurious. That this tall, flat crown, and in the era, the curl of the crown was more pronounced than the one I'm wearing here right now. It was typically finished in a shiny silk plush, and today this material is no longer being produced. In previous decades, the top hat had been the only option for men's formal wear to be worn with tailcoats, such as the morning coat or a frock coat or evening tailcoat. But now, the popularity of the top hat was fading along with the importance of the aristocracy. As you can see from this headwear lineup, there were lots of alternatives. Because top hats were stiff and had to be carried in a large box, this was also the time when the opera hat was invented. At first glance, it might look like a top hat, but it has actual coils on the inside, so it is collapsible, and then it looks somewhat like a top hat. Upon closer inspection, you can clearly see the difference. So what did it look like underneath the hat? Typically, it was slicked down, so it wouldn't poke out from underneath the hat. Some men also just cut their hair short, but if you wanted to slick it down, you used some kind of oil. This hair oil could be coconut oil, castor oil, or almond oil. Others used pomade or pomade or other concoctions. Definitely the most popular hair oil product was Macassar. All these hair oils and products were notoriously difficult to remove from fabric. And if you don't believe me, just ask my wife, because when I was wearing pomade, our bed linens were just a mess. In fact, it was so bad that the anti-Macassar was invented, which was typically a white piece of cloth that you would put on top of chairs so men wouldn't permanently stain the upholstery fabric. Now, it wasn't just the hair and the head that men liked to style. They also really groomed the facial hair during that decade. A moustache, rolled with wax, was en vogue. Frankly, looking at old photographs, some of these styles are quite interesting. The handlebar, the walrus, or the imperial style definitely were popular. Small beards or pencil moustaches could also be popular, and fuller beards were typically reserved for older gentlemen, while the younger chaps preferred the clean-shaven look. In terms of clothing, the dress shirts or shirts men wore during the Edwardian era were very different from the ones we wear today. First of all, shirts were much longer, folding between and around the legs, thus preventing the shirt from coming untucked. If you want to see what it looks like, check out the video from Antique Menswear. Shirts for men came mostly in different pastel colors, in stripes, block stripes, or micro patterns. The cuff of a shirt was either a barrel cuff that could be closed with buttons, closed with cufflinks that could be a double cuff, or they also had detachable cuffs as well as detachable collars. That meant you didn't have to wash the entire shirt by hand, but just launder the collar and the cuffs separately, which was pretty much the only thing of a shirt you would see in public anyways. Everything else was covered up by the neckwear and the waistcoat, which had a very high buttoning point. Often these starched collars were also polished, so they didn't quite look like cotton. Today you can still find them for evening wear, but back then they had many turn-down collar styles, club collars, square collars, standing collars, and the big difference was that they were generally quite tall compared to today's collars. You had to attach them to the shirt with a stud in the front and one in the back. Because of the height of 3, sometimes 4 inches, which is about 7.5 to 10 centimeters, some of them even got deadly. And we talk more about that in our 20th century fashion fails video. The type of collar you wore dictated part of the neckwear. If you had a collar with a very slim opening, you chose a very small knot. If you had a wider spread, you chose a bigger knot. Essentially, it's the same thing we do today if we pay attention to our outward appearance. Speaking of ties, there was lots of variety during the Edwardian era. You'd had regular neckties, you had bow ties, and cravats. You even had novelty ties like the belly warmer tie or the Windsor bow tie. Generally, fabric was still really expensive, and because waistcoats or vests were buttoned so high up, the ties were generally much shorter than the ones you see today. Formal silk ties typically came with much wider blades, which resulted in a bigger knot. At the time, it was very common to wear a stick pin, first of all to keep the tie in place, but to also add some decorative dazzle to the outfit. Now, those stick pins could be cheap or somewhat cheerful, or extremely expensive and diamond studded. Of course, it all depended on the class you belonged to and the size of your checkbook. Interesting, some pieces of neckwear, in particular bow ties, could be bought pre-tied with a little clasp in the back that was typically covered by the collar of the jacket. Honestly, the history of bow ties is pretty fascinating, and you can learn all about it in our video. In terms of jackets and suits, the idea that everything was still hand-tailed at the time is not quite true. Yes, there was of course a lot more handwork, there were a lot more tailors in business, but mass production had begun with uniforms and also had trickled down to the general population by then. You could find department stores who had off-the-rack suits, and they were often made by machine. By 1901, the frock coat had already lost quite a bit of its popularity, and the morning coat had become more and more popular. Now, that being said, younger men often didn't even wear a morning coat anymore, but something known as the lounge suit, which was an extremely casual thing, which then became the suit as we know it today. If you're interested in the very fascinating history of the suit, we got you covered. The lounge jacket was really the one that gained popularity most rapidly, and you could find them in still different versions. They were all definitely shorter than a morning coat or a frock coat, but sometimes still reaching mid-thigh. But they would always cover your rear end. Now, that's not something you can say about all modern jackets. These lounge jackets typically were ventless, but sometimes they did feature vents. Sometimes they were also cut more like a body coat and featured buttons in the back. Overall, variety in tailoring was bigger then than it is today. A common style that you saw in jackets was a rounded cutaway front, which means the quarters were really open, kind of inspired by a morning coat, just shorter. That being said, you could also find jackets single-breasted with very squared-off corners. So again, a lot of variety. Compared to a jacket today, the buttoning point was typically a lot higher. Jackets had 3 or 4 buttons in a single-breasted coat, and the button stance was quite big. That being said, you could also find double-breasted coats, and they were also rather tall and buttoned all the way. During this era, the sack suit was particularly popular in the US, and it would have very padded shoulders because that was the fashionable look at the time. Many jackets featured cuffs. Sometimes they could just be sewn-on stitches, or they could be actual cuffs, or something that draw the viewer's attention onto the cuff. Cuffs typically had either 2 or 3 buttons, so that's quite different than the majority of 4-button cuffs you see today. In terms of fabrics, linen, wool, cotton, or tweed was used, but oftentimes they weren't as soft and the finishing wasn't as good as it is today. That being said, they usually draped a lot better, and the intricate weaves and the yarns had a really phenomenal color depth. For sport jackets, tweed was really popular. Typically you had a center vent because it was used on horseback riding, or you also had action vents because you used it for more sportive pursuits. Why? Well, the pleats helped you to move around more easily. Functional elements such as patch pockets with buttons or flaps were also really popular at the time. You could also see men wearing a matching vest and jacket with contrasting trousers, or a suit with a contrasting vest or waistcoat. Typically, men were hardly ever seen without their jackets on. Only really hard-working physical laborers would sometimes take their jacket off, but even then, they would still wear a vest or a waistcoat, which is a nice segue into our next segment. Vests, or waistcoats, as they're now called in the UK, were often single-breasted, and if they did, they had about 5 or 6 buttons. At the front, they had very short points, unlike more modern waistcoats, or the ones you would see in the 1930s. The fancier styles had detachable or exchangeable buttons for their waistcoat, which is something you can still find in higher-end evening waistcoats today. Now, while single-breasted waistcoats were more common, you still had a range of double-breasted waistcoats, and they would usually button also quite high. Some of them were buttoned at an angle, some straight, some were flat at the bottom, others weren't. Again, lots of variety. the trousers at the turn of the century were rather slim cut. They were also known as drainpipe trousers and were favored for their slim silhouette. Typically, they had fishtails in the back if they were made for suspenders, and frog or side pockets. Now, belt loops weren't unheard of, and they were getting more popular, in particular in the United States. The rise of those trousers or pants was quite high and typically ended about 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch above your belly button. In previous decades, belt loops used to be something very, very casual trousers, but in the US, they now became also more popular for other clothing styles. Pleats and trousers weren't popular yet, but if you had a center pleat, you could definitely denote your wealth because the common man or family would not have had the ironing equipment to get this nice crease into your pants. Cuffs, or turn-ups as they call them in the UK, were popular for more casual pants. Others came without them. Overall, looking at older illustrations, you rarely see a break in the trouser because often they were worn with boots, and the slim hem probably didn't allow for much of a break. Probably the most popular choice of footwear for men at that time was still a pair of boots. Now, Oxfords were around, but they were more for casual pursuits, which is quite funny because today a cap-toe Oxford is probably the most formal shoe most men will ever own. Because so many men wore boots, there were also lots of different styles. You had Balmoral boots, button boots, and other variations. Typically, they were made from horsehide, cowhide, calfskin, or coltskin. Now, what's that? Well, the calf is the baby cow and the colt is the baby horse. During the Edwardian era, you also saw more material combinations in button boots. So you saw suede inserts with regular calf leather or different colors, which was basically the birthplace of the spectator. And to learn more about the history, we got a video for you. Note, the shoelaces they wore back then were often quite wide. And I mean really wide. The material was sparkly satin. Now, today, really stylish men still wear those for their evening wear with patent leather Oxfords. But back then, they would wear them with their casual, sporty outfits. If you're interested in that look or you want to upgrade your tuxedo, head over to a store where we have a small selection of wider shoelaces. Now, even though they had Oxfords back then, the lasts were quite different. In the US, a rounder shape with a higher toe box was quite popular. Personally, I can also tell that they had much finer stitching on the welt, but also on the uppers. And even the broguing holes were much smaller and refined. More obviously, the heel, even of men's boots, was much taller. And while today some people would mistake them for women's boots, back then it was quite normal to have relatively high heels. Yes, women's boot had even higher heels, and it was more delicate than men's heels, so you could always distinguish them. Just take a look at these heels from women's shoes and these from men's. Of course, the working class man didn't wear fine two-tone colored button boots. He would wear a pair of work boots with a rubber sole that could withstand quite a bit of abuse. In terms of overcoats, there were lots of varieties out there. I know some people think single-breasted coats were mostly popular, but you can also find double-breasted coats at the time. 6'3" or 8'4" configurations were quite common. So were fur collars, or velvet collars, or entire fur linings. Not only did they keep you warm, but they were also quite stylish. Another popular coat at the time was the Chesterfield coat, which was invented in the 1840s, and we have a full guide about its history on our website. It was basically a response to the tight frock coat, which wasn't removed indoors. Now, a Chesterfield was removed. Frankly, there were lots of other popular overcoats at the time. One of them was the Inverness Cape overcoat, and the other the Ulster. Now, both of those are long and below the knee and feature a cape. Now, an Inverness cape is named after Inverness, Scotland, and was originally known as an Inverness coat. By the 1880s, the sleeves were removed and the cape was extended. Depending on the cloth that you chose, you could wear an Inverness for an evening overcoat with a fine black worsted, or in the country if it was made out of tweed. Often the cape could be buttoned or hooked in the front, and sometimes they had different kinds of collars or lapels. Unlike the Inverness, an Ulster has longer sleeves, which means that the cape is shorter and you also can't button the cape in the front. The Ulster was invented by McGee and Company in 1866 as a hard-wearing weather coat. And if you want to learn more about that style and how it evolved over time, we have a guide for you. Another popular coat is the covert coat, which today is still popularized by the English brand Cordings. Originally meant for riding and hunting, it was rarely more than 34 inches long. Today it's quite a bit longer, and if you want to learn more about the history, we got you covered. Now, enough talk about overcoats, let's look at accessories. At the time, men would still wear pocket watches, and when Victoria died, commemorative fobs were sold that were cheap and affordable, so a lot of men wore them. Of course, if you were from the upper class, you had wonderful gold fobs and chains and watches that stood out from the crowd. You could also walk around with a walking cane or a stick, not for any physical help, but just to give your presence more authority. The cheapest form of cane was a wangi cane, as popularized by Charlie Chaplin. A common cufflink style was a solid gold or silver chain link, though you'd also find solid shank links at the time. Often they were intricately engraved. Eyewear was starting to vary too, and men could choose from a variety of monocles, eyeglasses, or pince-nez. Men could typically choose from gold, silver, tortoiseshell, or cellulite monocles. Some were even horn-rimmed. Pince-nez also came in a variety of styles, including the Fitzhugh style, sometimes also known as fingerpiece. Less popular at the time were eyeglasses with temples, which is a stark contrast to today, where most eyeglasses have temples. If you found them, they're particularly round wire frames with very slim temples that were very minimalistic. Now, the beauty of the Edwardian era was that as a gentleman, you really had a big wardrobe with something different for every occasion. Only, of course, if you had enough money. If you were a common man, you had a very limited wardrobe and just had to make do with it. In the evening, you had white tie ensembles or a black tie tuxedo. During the day, you could have a +4 suit, you could have a riding suit, and so forth. There were also cool iterations with belts in the jackets, lots of pleats, such as Norfolk jackets or half Norfolk jackets. Belted Norfolks or tweed suits had knickerbocker pants with over-the-calf knee socks in a thick wool. And you could go golfing or shooting with those. So it meant playing cricket or tennis. Hence the cable-knit tennis sweater or cricket sweater. Of course, for tennis you got warmer, so you didn't need a jacket, and there were tennis whites. And of course, then you have formal morning wear, which consists of a morning coat ensemble, such as the one I'm wearing here right now, or evening wear. And frankly, at the core, these haven't changed too much from the Edwardian era. Now, I could go on for hours about that, but you can also check out our in-depth black tie, white tie, and morning coat guides. And I promise you, they're probably the most comprehensive ones you'll find today. Honestly, that's much more effective than keeping me here for another decade or so. So, how long do you think it would take you to get dressed in the morning in 1901? Let us know in the comments. Now, in today's outfit, I'm wearing nothing from the Edwardian era. Why is that? Well, I'm simply too tall and too big. I just don't fit in their clothes, really. Plus, I have a big head, so finding a top hat from the era would cost thousands, if not hundreds thousands of dollars. That being said, my outfit is inspired by the era. Starting with my top hat, it's probably a post-war model. It is in silk plush, and while most people won't see the difference immediately, it definitely is less extreme than the top hats you would have seen in that era. My shirt has a clop collar, but it's overall smaller than what you would have seen back then. It also has an attached collar and it's not detachable. My bow tie is made from a silk bourrette, which is something you could have found back then, but this is a modern version with a houndstooth pattern from Fort Belvedere. It's off-white and green and works really well with my custom-made double-breasted waistcoat in a green velvet. My morning coat is from the 1960s in a dark gray with a herringbone pattern. I'm pairing it with a formal white linen pocket square from Fort Belvedere. My trousers are custom-made in a black and white houndstooth fabric that is made out of wool. They do feature cuffs, which is not something you would have typically seen on a more formal outfit like this one. My boots are modern button boots from Enzo Bonafè, from Bologna, and they work well with this very formal outfit. Last but not least, I'm wearing unlined gloves, which is typically something you would have worn at the time. They were quite tight and elegant. I chose the button closure and I leave them unbuttoned for an element of nonchalance. For a rich selection of buttoned gloves in interesting colors, lined and unlined, head over to our shop here. Oh, I forgot the cane. It's from Howell in England.